Chapter 9. The Patriots and Loyalists. Unlove thy neighbor. Confucius said, "Love thy neighbor as thyself. Do not do to others what thou wouldst not wish be done to thyself. Forgive injuries, forgive thy enemy. Be reconciled to him, give him assistance. Invoke God in his behalf." Now, because New Jersey was located between New York and Philadelphia, it was strategically important for both the British and Continental armies. As a result, Monmouth County was a hotbed of conflict between patriots and loyalists. Fighting was so intense between these two politically motivated groups of citizens, it felt more like a civil war than a revolution. Residents of Monmouth County and the counties surrounding them began choosing sides. About a third of the population aligned themselves with Great Britain. These were the Loyalists, and they were mostly the upper crust folks, merchants, and those who stood to gain financially from the outcome. Another third were patriots in favor of independence from Great Britain. They were mostly farmers and those people who had a stake in gaining independence from the mother country. And then the final third of the population was independent and mainly were comprised of Quakers who were pacifists. During the tension among the three different groups, it wasn't unusual for the local population to change sides if it kept them from harm or from dangerous neighbors or those who opposed them. The level of mistrust and fear in this area was intense. It truly was a hazardous environment in which to live, or state your own political views. You might have been killed in the middle of the night as a result of your position. As a result, most people avoided political discussion and kept their mouths mostly shut. While the Continental Army was fighting the Redcoats, some of the Loyalists were fighting a clandestine war of intimidation with some of the Patriots. The Patriots were not only engaged in sabotage and murder, they were also secretly supplying the Continental Army with whatever they needed. Government-sanctioned piracy. When the American Revolution began, America had no warships to fire upon the English Navy. Besides, America could not easily manufacture weapons. Much of the Continental Army's weaponry was provided by those redcoats who died in battle and left their weapons in the fields to be picked up by the Americans. In many ways, because Great Britain had the best trained and equipped army in the world, it's amazing we ever gained our independence. It took a different kind of fighting to wear down the Brits eventually. Because we had very few military ships to do battle with the British Navy, we began to repurpose more than 2,000 merchant ships to defend ourselves. Collectively, these privately owned vessels were outfitted with more than 18,000 guns and some 70,000 men who were called privateers. In a sense, it was government-sanctioned piracy. Also, some of the American colonies developed their own navies to defend or attack hostile ships. Eventually, George Washington did establish a naval force in 1775 to battle the British off the New England coast. He also authorized those privateers to help do damage to the British ships in whatever way they could. We could easily disassemble our military groups so they could run back to their farms to hide until the next mission. Eventually, it became a game of cat and mouse, which the Redcoats were not too adept at playing. But guerrilla warfare on land was not the only game we could play. We could terrorize the British in the local rivers and waterways by rowing whaleboats into Raritan Bay to wreak havoc on the British ships which were anchored in it. After the damage was done, the privateers would escape back into the creeks, marshes, and swamps along the bay where the whaleboats would be hidden until another night. For example, Pleasant Valley, which is present-day Marlborough, was well known by the British as the Hornet's Nest because it's where local patriots would continually sting them by capturing and sinking ships in Sandy Hook Bay and then seizing Tories to exchange for American prisoners. Privateering was often done under the cover of darkness by smaller whaleboats, which carried smaller cannons. During the daylight hours, these vessels could be hidden in the marshes or creeks, which emptied into Raritan Bay. When the sun went down, the British were mostly sleeping on their ships, so privateers would leave the creeks and wreak havoc on the British ships by firing a few shots into a ship's hull, or they'd steal supplies or even steal ships if possible. Privateering had become one of the most significant and effective military efforts in the entire war. In fact, by the end of the war, American privateers had seized some 1,500 British ships and captured more than 12,000 British sailors. Our sustained privateering efforts in Raritan Bay, the Atlantic Ocean, and other bays and rivers throughout the country did so much damage to both the private and military ships from England, it impacted the attitude of British merchants, who were losing too many ships and products that were being shipped to America. British commerce was losing revenue while the cost of insurance skyrocketed. Eventually, the population of people who lived near Great Britain's coastline were becoming concerned about a potential attack from American privateers. British merchants were pushing against their own government to end the war. As the conflict with Great Britain intensifies to full-blown battle, another patriot, Joshua Huddy, fell into the center ring of not just war, but in the nasty business of neighbor against neighbor, loyalists against patriots. But this patriot was far deadlier than any member of the Burroughs family. The exploits of Joshua Huddy during our war with the British frustrated British officials and the loyalist population of central New Jersey beyond belief. They hated him passionately and eventually hanged him in Highlands, New Jersey. He was, in fact, the last person killed who was connected to the Revolutionary War. Oddly, his death occurred almost immediately after the war, when a peace treaty was signed with Great Britain. Today, several places honor Huddy with memorials and plaques, such as Highlands, Toms River, Colts Neck, and Rumson. But Huddy's life was complicated, and he frequently got into serious trouble. He certainly supported the need for war, but he was also capable of committing extreme acts of violence and cruelty even toward those closest to him. It's hard to believe that such a violent individual like Huddy was born into a very prosperous family in Salem County in southern New Jersey. However, despite his family's good standing, he had always been in trouble, and eventually he was kicked out of the Quakers for his disorderly conduct. Huddy continued to be a bad boy for much of his life. He had been convicted numerous times for assault and theft. He continually found himself in financial difficulty. As such, he had to eventually sell his family's plantation to pay his debts and was forced into debtor's prison for a time. Before long, despite his rowdy ways, he married his first wife, who was a widow. Before his wife died, she gave birth to 2 daughters. Then he moved to Colts Neck in Monmouth County, where he married again to yet another widow who happened to inherit Colts Neck Tavern. The Monmouth County Sheriff accused Huddy during a later time of trying to steal the tavern from his wife and then force her children to leave. Oh, it was typical behavior for Huddy, and so he often found himself in trouble with the law or in court. Eventually, he made his way into prominence as the commander of an artillery company in the New Jersey militia during 1777. Huddy's bad boy attitude was perfect for his assigned job. Fellow patriots thought he was an extremely aggressive commander in the militia. He had no sympathy toward anyone, even friends or neighbors, who leaned toward the Loyalists. Most everyone feared him because of his reputation as a ruthless killer. Eventually, Huddy's notoriety as a militia officer and privateer made him a target for the Monmouth County Loyalists who wanted to punish him for his crimes. With a name like Titus Cornelius, Mahatma Gandhi said, "The moment the slave resolves that he will no longer be a slave, his fetters fall. Freedom and slavery are mental states." More than 8,000 slaves worked in New Jersey, which was second only to the number of slaves working in New York. Titus Cornelius, also known as Colonel Ty, had been a slave brought from Africa to be owned by John Corliss, a Quaker with a farm located along the banks of the Navesink River near the town of Shrewsbury. Quakers were pacifists and abhorred slavery. Nevertheless, Corliss owned slaves despite his faith. Generally, the Quakers taught slaves how to read and write. In some cases, they freed their slaves when they reached the age of 21. But Corliss provided no education, and absolutely no hope of any eventual freedom for any of his slaves. He was also tough on his slaves and would often whip them for minor infractions of the rules he set forth. Each member of his own faith had admonished him for the treatment of his slaves. These Quakers also disapproved of his blatant refusal to provide his slaves with an education. Even after the Quakers officially forbade slavery in 1758, Corliss is said to have replied he had not thought it was his duty to give the slaves their freedom. Meanwhile, despite his enslavement, Titus began to learn more about the political leanings of the nearby families in the area. Eventually, the Quakers revoked Corliss' membership as a Quaker because of his continuing refusal to free his slaves. By 1775, the British-placed governor of Virginia issued a proclamation of which Titus soon became aware. It offered freedom to any slaves or indentured servants who would escape their masters and join the British to fight in the war. The proclamation caused some 100,000 slaves in the region to conspire against their masters and join the British cause with the hope of becoming truly free. Titus escaped from Corliss' property after the proclamation was made public. Soon he was fighting in the British cause. When Corliss discovered Titus had fled, he advertised in local papers promising a reward of £3 for the capture and return of Titus. Assuming the adopted name of Tai, Cornelius enlisted first in the Ethiopian Regiment and fought in the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, where he had demonstrated his ability as a soldier. Both sides were impressed. Later, he gained prominence among the Loyalists when he captured a captain in the Monmouth militia and brought him to the infamous Sugar House prison in New York City. Tai unofficially called himself a colonel, even though the title would never be formally recognized by the British. But his knowledge of the landscape in Monmouth County and his aggressive leadership provided him with the legitimacy he desired. He was not only well known for his efforts, he was also feared as a Loyalist guerrilla commander. As a result of his success, he was paid by the British to destabilize the region, which made the entire area a place where neighbors feared for their lives. The plan to use guerrilla tactics was the brainchild of New Jersey's royal governor and Loyalist, William Franklin. Remember him? He was Ben Franklin's son, and his plan was really an act of retaliation for the Patriot activities, which led to the confiscation of Loyalist property. The final straw was reached when the Patriots of Monmouth County started hanging Tories under a convenient vigilante law. Now, one of Tai's most daring raids was in 1779 when he and some 50 African Americans captured 80 cattle, 20 horses, as well as 2 well-known patriots. Tai and his men were paid 5 gold guineas for their effort. They often targeted wealthy, slave-holding patriots during their assaults, which frequently took place at night. He would take prisoners and free slaves if there were any. Very often, Tai would not only steal from patriot families, he would murder them and burn down their property. He could be a very vicious man, and it's why so many people feared him. After every raid, Tai and his fighters would quickly make their way back to their base of operation in Sandy Hook. It was called Refugee Town, where they lived in tents and small structures that were just below and surrounding the lighthouse. Before long, Colonel Tai began to serve with the Black Brigade, which was a group of 24 black Loyalists. This group would often work together with a Loyalist unit comprising all whites, which was called the Queen's Rangers. The groups would join together to defend British-occupied New York City. The Black Brigade also helped slaves escape and later assisted the same slaves to immigrate to Nova Scotia for resettlement after the war had ended. The Patriots feared the Black Brigade even more than the regular British Army because many of the former slaves knew precisely which of the homes belonged to the Patriots because they may have been slaves there at one time. Clash of the Titans. And this is from the film Clash of the Titans. Thetis said, "I beat him at his own game. I simply turned myself into a shark." During the start of the Revolutionary War, if you were an odds maker, you might very well favor the British to win the fight. After all, the British, beyond all doubt, had the best equipped and best trained army in the entire world. While soldiers on both sides were fighting on the battlefields of New York and New Jersey, some loyalists and patriots were fighting up close and personal. So too, both Colonel Tighe, a loyalist, and Captain Joshua Huddy, a patriot, were each fighting with a purpose in mind. Each thought his cause was the just cause. Almost everyone feared both Colonel Tighe and Captain Joshua Huddy, and each thought they would win in the end. They both had much more in common, however, than they realized. They shared a mutual destiny, and in 1780 they would meet face to face. It was in the middle of the night in Colts Neck, New Jersey, when Colonel Tighe led a small group of African Americans and Queens Rangers to raid the home of Captain Joshua Huddy. Huddy was in his home next to the Colts Neck Inn. According to a well-documented account of the attack, Huddy and an African American servant, Lucretia Emmons, were in the house alone as Colonel Tighe's band of loyalists began firing the muskets. Incidentally, Huddy had allowed his house to be used for the storage of an extensive collection of stolen muskets which were provided to the militia as needed. As a result, Huddy and his companion had lots of guns and ammunition for just two people. If there's any humor to be realized from this horrific attack, it's this. Huddy and his servant were able to hold off Colonel Tighe's siege on the house for almost 2 hours by running from window to window and firing a musket toward the outside as the servant girl reloaded musket after musket right behind him, thus giving the illusion to anyone attacking that there were more than just two people inside. It was a remarkably creative strategy which appeared to be working until Tighe gave the orders to burn down the house. As Huddy realized his ploy would no longer work, he ran outside to surrender and to request that the fire be put out so that his house could be spared from destruction. Now, some historians say the Loyalists obliged his request, while others write that they were so upset about being fooled, they let the house burn to the ground. Huddy's slave girl, Emmons, who some say was also his girlfriend, managed to escape. Today, there's an historic sign in Colts Neck which marks the site of the house. Well, Huddy is now in handcuffs and surrounded by Loyalists. He's led from his house next to the Colts Neck Inn to a place called Black Point, which is today's Rumson. It's where the Navesink River joins the Shrewsbury River. Black Point was a strategic location because it was next to an inlet leading to the Atlantic Ocean, which does not exist today. Interestingly, during this period, the Navesink River flowed directly into the Atlantic Ocean, where a British ship was waiting to take Huddy across Raritan Bay and into New York Harbor to a prison in British-held New York City. Coincidentally, there was a battle at Black Point just 1 year earlier during 1779, in the same area as where the British were trying to leave in a boat with Huddy. Now, this battle started when a British raiding party marched from Tinton Falls to Black Point. While they were trying to embark from Black Point, they were attacked by a detachment of the Continental Army. 11 Americans were killed or wounded. The battle ended when a flag of truce was flown and both sides walked away. The Great Escape. Angelus Silesius in the 1600s said, "By the will art thou lost, by the will art thou found, by the will art thou free, captive and bound." So now, back to our story. Colonel Tighe is trying to embark on a boat to deliver Joshua Huddy to a ship in the Atlantic Ocean, which will carry him to prison in New York City. However, the Monmouth County militia got wind of the capture and followed closely behind Colonel Tighe until they reached Black Point. When Huddy was placed on a boat to begin his voyage to captivity, the militia began its assault on Huddy's captor. During the encounter, the boat overturned in the swift current where the Navesink estuary enters the Shrewsbury River. 6 Loyalists were killed, and Colonel Tighe himself was wounded in the wrist. Later, Colonel Tighe would die from this wound after it became infected with tetanus. Because Huddy was not clearly seen, or because muskets were never that accurate, he was shot in the hip by friendly fire, presumably as he tried escaping to the shoreline. Huddy's injury forced him to stay in hiding for several months while his wound healed. Then, in 1781, Huddy's bravery in escaping from the British at Black Point was rewarded with an important assignment: to command a blockhouse in Toms River and guard the local salt works. Now, salt was an essential commodity to both sides. For the most part, it was used to keep meat from spoiling. A blockhouse in those days was a fortification in which the people inside of it could fire in all directions. A year later, Huddy was confronted at the blockhouse in Toms River by a large group of both British and Loyalist troops, who eventually burned down the village of Toms River. Huddy surrendered because he and his men had run out of gunpowder to defend themselves. He was immediately taken to the notorious Sugar House Prison in New York City on a whaleboat. I'll explain Huddy's fate, but first, a bit about William Franklin, who also plays a role in this story. Famous father and infamous son. William Franklin said, "If you intend to set the colonies aflame, take care to run away by the light of it." Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin's illegitimate son, William Franklin, had been the last royal governor of New Jersey before the Patriots had arrested him for siding with the British. Remember, if you will, Ben was a patriot, while his son William was a loyalist. As the proponents of independence grew more substantial, a governing body was formed in New Jersey to supersede the authority of the royal governor. It was called the Provincial Congress of New Jersey, and in 1776 its members ordered William Franklin to be placed under house arrest at Proprietary House in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. He would remain under house arrest with his wife Elizabeth for 5 months while the Revolutionary War continued and the United States moved closer to declaring independence. While under house arrest, William Franklin tried to reassert his power by calling on the New Jersey Assembly to meet with him. A representative of the Provincial Congress in New Jersey did meet with William Franklin and presented him with an option. If he would be officially arrested and sent to prison, or if he agreed to step down from the governorship, he could leave Perth Amboy to stay peaceably at Princeton, Bordentown, or at a farm property which William owned in Willingboro, New Jersey. Well, William refused to agree with stepping down as government, so he was promptly arrested. William's wife was left behind at Proprietary House, where she would continue to live for another year, but she would never see her husband again. After a hearing, the Continental Congress decided William Franklin should be removed from New Jersey and taken to a prison in Connecticut. 9 days later, the Declaration of Independence was ratified and adopted by the Continental Congress, which ironically included William's father, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's revenge. General George Washington said, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism." William was held as a prisoner in Connecticut until 1778. His wife had left Proprietary House to live in British-occupied New York City, where she died shortly after that. When Franklin was released from prison, he moved to New York City, where he became the primary leader of the Loyalists and organized military units to fight on the British side. Oh, he knew all about Joshua Huddy, and he hated him. Huddy had just been captured in Toms River and brought to Sugar House Prison in New York. However, William Franklin convinced the British authorities to release Huddy from the prison in New York City so he could be used as a bargaining chip in an exchange of prisoners. Well, that's what Franklin told everyone, but his intention, was far more deadly. There would be no prisoner exchange. Instead, Huddy was summarily removed from the prison and sent to Highlands, New Jersey, where Franklin intended to hang him in revenge for the murders of the Loyalists. On April 12, 1782, he arrived under guard in a section of Highlands called Gravelly Point. Before he would be executed in what today is Huddy Park, they allowed him to dictate and sign his will. He gave all possessions to his 2 daughters, and then it was over. When Huddy's body was found and recovered by the Patriot forces during the next day, they read a sign attached to his body. We, the refugees, having long with the grief beheld the cruel murders of our brethren, determined not to suffer without taking vengeance, and thus begin, having made Captain Huddy as the first object to present to your view. And we further determined to hang man for man while there is a refugee existing. Up goes Huddy for Philip White. Now White was one of the loyalists they accused Huddy of murdering. Our first international incident. Another quote from Mahatma Gandhi. The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. General Washington's troops, militia and regulars, were outraged with the hanging of Joshua Huddy and demanded retaliation for what they perceived as an act of murder and not an act of war. Washington declared if the individual responsible for Huddy's death was not turned over to the Continentals, a British captain would be chosen at random among the prisoners of war and executed. Less than 2 months after the hanging of Huddy, British Captain Charles Asgill was selected in a drawing to be the one punished as revenge. Eventually, Washington and members of Congress determined that the execution of Asgill would result in more unnecessary violence by both sides. And besides, everyone knew the Revolutionary War was coming to an end. But Washington needed to save face with his troops who wanted revenge. As a result, the French foreign minister helped Washington and the Congress by publicly appealing for a stay of execution for Asgill. Congress agreed gladly, and it was over. Later, British General Henry Clinton wrote to General Washington, calling the execution of Captain Joshua Huddy an act of barbarity. Oddly, Joshua Huddy was one of only 2 American prisoners of war executed by the British during the American Revolution. Huddy was buried in an unknown location on the grounds of the Old Tennant Church in Manalapan Township in New Jersey, where a simple military marker sits near the church itself. More than 400 people attended his funeral service. Huddy's contributions to the Patriot cause in present-day Monmouth and Ocean counties are commemorated in several monuments and parks named for him. And while his methods of terroristic intimidation and murder among communities of loyalists seem barbaric, he remains a hero of the American Revolution. Benjamin Franklin and his son William only saw each other one more time after the Revolutionary War came to an end. They met in London during 1785 to sort out some business and financial matters. After the strictly business meeting, the 2 men never spoke again. Benjamin died in Philadelphia 5 years after meeting with his son, who died in London during 1813.